And it says we are live. Hi, everyone. Number one Marmaduke fan here. And this is kind of exciting. I'm joined by one of the oldest friends of the channel back in my the old days of the channel from last year, Lieutenant Fish. Say hi to everyone, Lieutenant.
Good evening. Nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And thanks for joining us. So the story of how we met, I think I was reviewing Punisher the Platoon, and I was thinking maybe this is kind of SJW. And I recall you gave me some pushback and encouraged me to keep checking it out, and I ended up loving that series. So in a way, you kind of encouraged me to stick with the series and not be too judgmental of it. Do you recall that?
I don't remember offhand. I do remember, though, that I think the first couple reviews I heard from, I'd kind of held off on it, even though it was Garth Ennis, just because Captain Cummings wasn't, like, he had kind of panned it, or someone else had kind of panned it that I was listening to. But then after taking a closer look and reminding myself of Garth Ennis' first Punisher run back when I was in college, it was definitely turned out to be worth it.
Definitely. And what was interesting about it was I think I'm used to like stuff about Vietnam being kind of like preachy, why were we in Vietnam? But I think that Garth Ennis was able to, I don't know, like bring in several perspectives on Vietnam into a book where it felt like, there are, old soldiers who were gung-ho about America, and there are old soldiers who were kind of irritated about how America handled Vietnam. Even just like a little bit of balance, I think, makes for a more compelling story instantly. And then he was able to there's so many good things about that series. That was definitely one of the gems from last year.
Well, the framing narrative he had with the interviews, and then showing that he was interviewing folks from both sides, really helped give the extra perspective, rather than having it solely set as a contemporary book
Right.
in the Vietnam setting.
Right, and it even
because you know veterans are not gonna, no one in the same unit thinks the same way. You're always going to get perspective changes, especially 30 years after the fact, which was very realistic.
And it also touches on how someone who just has reader's knowledge of a war doesn't really have on-the-ground knowledge of the war. Like the interviewer had this sort of thesis about Vietnam that he wanted to defend. And then the soldiers then have a perspective on the war, which, doesn't always line up with his astute thesis as sort of a journalist.
Yeah, that definitely, it's very different coming at it from different angles like that, and just what you've lived versus what you've read. Now, I see that every day in my work as well, coming from, even though I've been in the service for a long time, I don't have the firsthand knowledge of a lot of the experiences I see with other people, or the types of stuff that people have gone through, especially the last 20 years or so, 18 years.
And as you described it, you're by service, Navy and Army, right?
I was Army enlisted after college, and then got bored when I got out and went back in the Navy.
It's so interesting to me. Like, I've never done any service at all. I've just been like a book nerd, about the history of war. And it's amazing to me how many prominent voices within, not just Comics Geek, but just sort of comics discussion generally have this service connection. Maybe even it dates back to like how popular comics were for the armed services going back generations. But a lot of very thoughtful people in comics have this connection in their past, I think.
It gives you a lot deeper, not understanding necessarily, but a lot deeper, the broader experiences. They may not necessarily be deep. I never saw direct combat anywhere I've been, but I've been able to interact with people and learn from people, and there were close calls periodically, but nothing like, a lot of the people you see, or people, getting I've been doing research recently on stuff for some of the folks who got the Medal of Honor in the last few years, and some of those things, and reading those experiences, and it's just a completely different animal. But at the same time, you go back to like World War II, and you had folks like, there's one political cartoonist who actually went on the front lines as a journalist, and he would do the single frame strips. I don't remember his name is off the top of my head. But then you had folks like Milt Caniff, who were either 4F for medical reasons or something else, but they really, really felt tied to service, especially during that period, and being able to contribute any way they could.
Yeah. or Kirby. You know, Kirby. What did he do? He worked as a sketch artist, right? As a scout, he'd have to bring back sketches. Is that am I remembering right?
I don't have as great background knowledge for some of those older folks as
Okay.
I haven't read as much except for Milton Caniff is the guy I've been reading a lot more of the last couple of years.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons I've had you on. Is you see, I when I was in college, I had to write a thesis about comics history, so I ended up kind of familiarizing myself with a lot of big names that I hadn't read, and things like Karl Barks and Kniff would show up, and then I meet you, and it's sort of like anytime I mention a comics person's name, you not only know of them, you've read their work, so you're someone in the comics community who has kind of a broader experience with comics beyond just some of the popular superhero stuff. So I guess tell us a little bit about your history reading comics and some of the like the best names you've come across while reading about comics.
Well, we talked a little bit as a preview about Dessinées, and really my first introduction to comics was when we were just moved to Southeast Asia in the 80s, and my dad bought a couple Tintin books, which were unfortunately at the time in Bahasa Indonesia, since they'd been translated already into like 50 plus languages.
Huh.
But it was, they were already in the early 80s, those books were already 30, 40 years old, titles he picked up. But then, but he'd grown up with them, reading them when he was living in South America growing up. And so it was, passing that along. And so I really grew up in a European school environment. I grew up with a lot of Tintin and Asterix. Those were the two big titles. And then some of the other British weekly comics, we'd get people would mail them, or you'd get care packages sometimes. And the only other thing I can remember as a U.S. comic directly as a really young kid was a small, like a digest version, like they're putting out now, of the very first Incredible Hulk miniseries, like the 6-issue miniseries before it became an ongoing issue. But it was like an early or mid 80s digest reprint. And I read through that quite a few times, but not too much other Marvel or DC stuff until I'd wind up back in the States around 8th grade.
Now, this might be something where it might be hard for an American audience to click with this. I recall reading, not Karl Barks, but Don Rosa. Don Rosa would talk about Karl Barks' influence on him and touring abroad, and like Americans might be really surprised at how big some of these properties and some of these characters are, and how like American comics like are big properties like the Spider-Mans and the Supermans. It's of course people will have heard of them in Europe, but a character like Tintin or a character like Babar or Asterix, that's a really big deal in these countries, right?
Well, yeah, and you're right to say Karl Barks too, because Walt Disney was another one of those ones that translated. You'd see the characters, copyright free, painted everywhere in Southeast Asia or other places. Just use the characters on the side of a preschool or a daycare, or on an ice cream label or anything else. But I'd read some of the first books I read for those were like 40, 50-year-old reprints of Uncle Scrooge comics, like the collected stories and things like that. And some of those, again, were very memorable, and they really held up. They're fairly timeless.
Yeah.
In terms, even though the technology or something like that might seem a little cheesy, but the stories themselves didn't rely on anything that was going on at the time.
Right. Though you could occasionally see like something contemporary. I was boning up a little bit just as I was rereading Tintin books, and this surprised me. But Herge for the occupation, right? So
yeah, as a journalist, so he started off doing those first few books were a little more focused, a little more realistic. The first one I think was Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, which I still haven't read in English, and then Tintin in the Congo, which I've seen in French, but I've never seen an English copy yet. Of course. Those ones were obviously more particular. And then Tintin the Blue Lotus, that is a actual period of time, obviously. That's about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. And so that is that's an actual event.
Mhm.
But largely after that, and Tintin in America, I think is when he really started. He created the fictitious countries of Sildavia and Borduria,
Yeah.
and really, even when he was in Europe, you rarely knew where he actually was when he was
And,
traveling between, aside from a few places that would get called out. So I think he found out, his stuff would do better, his material would work better if it wasn't necessarily tied to a particular place. Like
right.
it showed up more later on in the future. I mean, you had Tintin in Tibet, which is maybe an issue now. I haven't even gone back to that one in about 10 to 15 years. But, and most of the Spanish, aside from Tintin, the Peruvian ones, the other Spanish countries were all made up, I think, with a couple of exceptions.
Right. So all I've read so far is Tintin. Let me think. Uh, the introduction of Captain Haddock. That's the
Yep.
crab with the golden claws, the shooting star,
Yep.
and the secret of the unicorn. Because I'm kind of a Haddock nut,
Yep.
so my experience was a little bit different. Where I heard of Tintin, and I remember copying drawings of Tintin from a drawing book, but never like seeing a Tintin comic. And then in the 90s, this animated series comes out based on Tintin's adventures, and I really resonated with that. And then that was sort of my gateway to looking for the comics. And as much nostalgia I have for the TV series, I think that it's in the comics where Hergé's line work and the adventurous pace of it, it's going to last forever. So let me think.
The thing with Tintin,
yeah.
too, is that, especially if you've been reading him for 20 or 30 years plus beforehand, then you see the TV show and you're like, those voices, the animation isn't quite what you have in mind, because
Yeah.
it's so iconic, but everyone's going to have a slightly different picture in their head about how it's going to work out. And so the most recent movie actually captured that fairly well.
But the Spielberg one,
guy one, yeah, that he captured the characterizations pretty well.
Yeah.
And obviously he had some good guys for the voice acting and the motion capture.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's always true of, like most 90s animations, is especially if they're like based on a pre-existing property, you kind of have to look at them for what they were. They were trying to make, existing properties work.
Yeah, a little lower budget too, I think.
Yeah. Now, though, if you are familiar with the animated series and not the comics, I'd highly encourage you to kind of graduate to reading the comics and seeing them work, because I think that a lot of older comics, especially people like Hergé, it's sort of like a crash course in what comic storytelling is before you bring in all the bells and whistles. The fact that they're so gripping while using very simple characters and very simple settings, I think it's a testament to what the medium can do. Like there aren't like, big upside down, dramatic bird's eye angle, bird's eye views or worm's eye views that I see that much. But in the ones I've read, they're really gripping and they get you into the rush, mostly based on just what's happening and how clearly everything is communicated.
There's also the issue that they were originally done for, I think, either weeklies or monthlies. And so they were done in chapters, which are totally taken out in the books. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is that the US reprints now are only going to the digest sizes. If you want to get the full size, the full bande dessinée oversized books, you need to go on probably eBay or maybe order them from the UK.
Yeah.
And the UK versions really only have a couple different slang terms here and there, and that might have even changed since in the last 20 years.
Now, when you say digest size, the books
like 6x4 or 8, smaller than 8.5 by 11.
Okay, so I had a bigger American release of some of those before I gave them away.
The Brown and Little versions that they were putting out for 50 plus years were oversized technically.
Okay.
They were like bigger than 11 by 17. They were the normal European comic size.
Yeah. So, of course, there have been multiple editions of these, but you're saying like the newest editions, they're going even smaller.
Yeah, they said they're not going to be printing the original oversized version anymore.
Oh, it's a pity.
They may be collected with multiple stories in the same book, but it really misses out, even though they're not incredibly detailed. The framing and the artwork and the size of the text also is going to be lacking.
Something that might be worth noting is that Hergé would redraw some of his stories, sometimes even more than once. And since I was kind of specifically interested in Captain Haddock, I started collecting with the Crab with Golden Claws. And I think this is one I know he redrew this one because that was one of the ones where he had African American characters. And I used to think, oh, well, they must have made him change that because they didn't like the portrayal of African American characters. And what I learned is that the American audience was too racist for Hergé. They didn't want black and white characters appearing together. So Hergé had to redraw those characters in order to for them to appear in the American market. And that's become the standard edition that's been used since.
That's something I hadn't read. I mean, there's a couple of volumes I know of interviews and research material that's been released, but I haven't ever had a chance the last few years to pick up anything new by him.
Okay. Well, what's interesting to me is his willingness to redraw one of his stories in order to introduce it to a new market. So one of the things I recall is in the Shooting Star, originally the villain was going to be American, and then in the redraw it became like Sao Rocco or something. He made
I think Sao Paulo, like it's Brazilian or something, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and so what's interesting about that is that makes it more universal. It allows him to take. I think that Hergé knew he had a character with universal appeal, so he was really willing to rework some of his older stories to promote that universal appeal. And it makes sense. Like if I'm an American kid and I read a book where America is the bad guy, it's a little weird. But if it's a fictitious country, then you get more into the spirit of the adventure.
Well, I think the guy in Shooting Star was also a proto Rastapopoulos. If you look at the shape of his nose and some of his other characteristics.
Right. And this may be a little off topic, but this is where like some of the critics of, Hergé come in and they, they infer something like, oh, well, this might have had an anti-Semitic context. I don't see that at all. What Hergé explained is that he would kind of pick American sounding names. And then sometimes these would have like a somewhat Jewish sound to them. Like Bullwinkle was the one I read. It's been the villain's name gets translated differently. But I guess that is something of note is that he did live in a Nazi occupied country. And so this became something significant in his life. Was the insinuation from some people, like, was he a Nazi sympathizer? Was he guilty based on publishing his comics in a German sympathetic newspaper? Have you read much on that? The whole discussion?
I haven't followed that at all, to be honest. I think in general, some of his character designs have the potential to be interpreted that way, but really, when you see how much silhouettes and shadows play into the design of his visual medium, you want characters who are recognizable to the audience, whether the lighting is poor or something else, to give a hint at how the story's progressing. And you see that throughout all of his books, where there's always the nose is one of the key things, whether it's a square Roman nose or a bulbous potato nose or something else, or wearing a bowler hat or a mustache or beard. The beard might be pointy and the mustache pointing or rolling in different directions, but you have the ability to instantly pick out the same character or recognize them as you're going forward. And sometimes then you'll have Easter eggs of characters you've seen before showing up again, just in the background or something else. But it ties the world together too in that sense.
Right, and I think he's also noteworthy for, as Tintin goes across these adventures, all across the world in all of these different cultures, there's often a tendency for there to be, good guys and bad guys of multiple races. So I've never bought the, everybody's racist, diatribe generally, and I've always thought that Hergé seemed to me like a guy who may have been ahead of his time in wanting to have like a diversity of characters, good and evil, in the adventurous world he was creating.
You definitely see that throughout. I mean, everywhere he goes, he meets good characters and bad characters in the region, whether it's South America, India, the Middle East, Europe, obviously, Northeast Asia. There's sympathetic characters as well as villains, and then you also have some villains who are transnational and show up repeatedly. But yeah, I think one of the most interesting ones after the fact was Flight 714, just because And you see it. He makes a real good use of actually using the language. Like I couldn't speak for some of the other non romantic languages, but the Bahasa Indonesia, he's he'll put subtitles in, but he's not just writing in English and just writing an asterisk from Bahasa Indonesia or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. So there's a sort of attention to detail in portraying a culture when he has Tintin visit that culture, essentially.
Yeah, it definitely makes more sense that way, because you can see that people are literally not understanding each other, and you're seeing what they're hearing, and it makes a lot more sense that way too.
Yeah. Something of interest about Hergé's drawing style. Now, this is something you might be able to comment on, having read. I read a little Asterix, but you've read maybe a broader sampling of these kinds of comics. But I've seen Hergé's style described as, I think it's called linge clair, or the clear line. And I think that's a good description, because if you look at it, every line is there for a reason. And he almost has zero lines that he doesn't need for a composition. Like buildings are reduced to very simple ideas, a couple little lines to show texture. So could you comment on, how influential is that use of line work for more beyond just Tintin, other bande dessinée examples?
I think, it's one of those things where there's not a lot of shading involved. It's pretty much just the lines and the colors. And you get more work out of the colors as well. I mean, they do double duty in that sense. And you have lines in the foreground or background to show grass or depth or anything else. But I think, sorry, I don't have any of the books directly in front of me because I wasn't certain which titles. But I think Asterix does use that format as well. It may also be a period for the earlier periods, due to printing limitations and things like that as well, just where you're limited as far as what you can and can't do with the materials at hand, or what's cheaper, especially for mass production.
I got you. For people who may not be familiar with Asterix, I'd say that's kind of like maybe the second most famous example of this type of comic. I've read one book, and for the life of me can't remember which Asterix book I read. But what would be like your pitch for checking out Asterix if you haven't yet?
Asterix is basically, it's basically the best set. Oh man, it's hard. I can't put that in one sentence thing. Basically, you're talking about an adventure comic with a ridiculous number of puns and gags. Mostly they translate fairly well, but it's very cartoony. It's more like, okay. It's more like a Walt Disney type of adventure in 20 AD or 50 AD.
Yeah.
Or 50 BC. Yeah, it's Julius Caesar.
Yeah. Caesar's literally a villain in it. Yeah.
He's a recurring character. He's not a villain every single time, but most of the time, he's kind of the background villain.
And maybe similar to Tintin, Asterix is a character who kind of has an instantly identifiable face based on the way he's drawn. Like I think of the chubby, cheerful cheeks. Like as soon as you see those chubby, cheerful cheeks, that's the Asterix style, and you can pick it up instantly.
Well, yeah, Asterix. That's Goscinny and Uderzo have a very recognizable style, and they did do some other character books too, just like Hergé also did some non-Tintin books.
Yeah,
and so you see it, and you're like, that's exactly the same artist. And it's interesting to see the different perspective. But yeah, also in Asterix, they have the size variation is much, much greater because it's so much more cartoony. It's much more Walt Disney or DuckTales style, where Obelix is 10 times the mass of Asterix and about 3 times as tall. And then he has a tiny little helmet, whereas Asterix, being so much shorter, has a helmet with large wings designs on it. And then all the other characters too. And the big thing about Asterix too, though, is that because everything is a gag, that's not even really the names of the characters in the original French.
Right.
And so you'll see that in the subtitles if you look at my, or in the audio and the subtitles on my Asterix and Cleopatra DVD release. review, but it's extreme. Like they translate a little bit differently sometimes, but the English that has traditionally tried to match the French, but in the spirit of the humor, in the spirit of the terminology.
It's a similar problem for manga translators to try to convey a Japanese pun in English. So they come up with an English approximate that's similar to the Japanese original.
Definitely, but I think some of the folks who did this, they were really much more invested in, I think, than a lot of the more recent commercial things, just as far as the amount of time and effort. But French is also, as a Romance language, can be a little easier to work with sometimes.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned it before, so this might be good for people who should be checking out your channel, but you've done numerous, movie reviews of interesting foreign films, including a live-action adaptation of Asterix, and kind of knocked my socks off that it existed. And then you also get into sometimes like the peculiar charm of these movies. Like I didn't think I would ever be interested in seeing a live-action Asterix adaptation, but you'll kind of hone in on what makes these movies work or don't work. You want to talk a little bit about your interest in foreign flicks?
Basically, it's just one of those things where there's a lot of material out there, and unfortunately, there's not always a real market for it stateside. And so sometimes I just got in the habit back when I started collecting DVDs of looking on some of the websites for things that were a little bit more off the beaten path.
Yeah.
And originally, as a DVD, you had to make sure you had a player that could play a non-region 1 or non-US DVD, and that was a little trickier, but thankfully it's gotten a little bit easier with the exception of Blu-ray now.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things out there, and it's really just a matter of, if you know what you like, there's stuff out there, even if it's not in the US. And
right.
Netflix and Prime have improved as well for some releasability things recently.
Right. And maybe like something that's key to your channel is you're talking about movies that are interesting, that I don't know if anyone else on the internet is talking about the specific genres you're interested in. So they're not going to find like there's a million manga anime review channels, but I don't think I'm ever going to find like another channel that's looking at foreign films and digging into like the particulars of the movies and talking about some of the details of the DVDs and where it would be possible to find these. So you have a really unique sense of taste, I think, in the YouTube review market.
Well, I appreciate the feedback there. My main thing was trying to choose movies that I haven't seen people talk about. A lot of them were because the movies were either released after DVDs started coming out before YouTube came around, and so a lot of the newer releases obviously get touched on more frequently. In addition to the import market, which is always smaller. So there's plenty of written reviews you can find for a lot of the stuff, but I really want to try and capture some clips or show the trailer and just give a little bit more of a indication about the nature of the film. Unfortunately, it's always a copyright headache as well.
Right. This might be a little spicy, but I recall when I was talking about like feminist interpretations of French film, I had to talk about like this really creepy, like sexy movie Solo, and you had heard of the title. I'm not going to say you watched it, but you're even familiar with like some of like the really avant-garde film that I've discussed based on me trying to look into feminist theory on this kind of stuff. So I can tell you've got your ear to the ground for a lot of obscure and intriguing films.
Thanks. Yeah, Salo, I think as Fellini maybe. But yeah, DVDtalk.com is where I got hooked back right my sophomore year in college, and either the message boards there, mainly the message boards and the reviews, and there was always a thread going on for what's the most shocking movie you've ever seen, or what's the most graphic thing you've seen on film, and there's always people comparing and contrasting. And then you had something back at the time, the big hot stuff was something like Battle Royale.
Yeah.
Which obviously is a little tame, comparatively speaking, but it came out in Japan immediately following Columbine, and so it didn't get a U.S. release for obvious reasons. And tracking that down on a legit Hong Kong or Japanese DVD with subtitles, and then doing something like that was different, and a lot of people hadn't heard about stuff like that at the time. And I think that around the same time was when Boondock Saints, the first one, came out, and that was, oh yeah, that was the really edgy, really cool, cool new thing back in '99 or so. And I think that first copy I imported was from Canada because the US version was a Blockbuster one that had like 5 minutes cut out of it.
Yeah.
And so it was very, you get in the right community and you start figuring out what you want to see, and you can always find someone who has more information about where to dig it up.
Yeah. For comics as well, you introduced me to the Underburbs, and I see kind of a connection between the kind of comics you recommend and the kind of movies you recommend. So, like Eric Powell's The Goon, the Underburbs. I'd say that there's this sort of consistent tendency for you to be interested in really stylish comics, and also it's not that they're bad. It's comics that don't necessarily like make the front page of Bleeding Cool or something. Could you maybe like connect your interest in comics with your interest in movies?
It's always looking for something that's, off the beaten path. Like I'm not afraid to pick up a random indie title, although it doesn't happen quite as frequently sight unseen as it did back in college. But it's just, if it looks good and it sounds interesting, then I'll give it a shot. Whether it's, an established character or not, it's just some things grab you more than others for film or for comics or books or anything else. And comics really have to work at that, or they may not have to work as hard as, say, a novel, because you can see indications of quality normally right up front.
Right. The novel, it's all about the prose, and you can debate the pros and cons of an author's prose, but the artist grabs your attention right away on the front cover before you even buy it. And
yeah, a artist, I might not even know who they are, but if it looks good, it's a different story. But a writer, like a novelist, I have set writers who I'm happy to pick up almost anything they put out. Even if I haven't, I'm not going to, open it and read the first chapter before I buy it. But oftentimes you'll have, blurbs or something else that, but a lot of it is background and history with that creator.
Mm-hmm. This might be worthwhile. So, like for people like me, who we've heard of Tintin, we've maybe read some Tintin, and we're interested to find more of this kind of stuff. So, you actually had a background of reading some of this growing up in overseas, not in Americas, right?
Yep.
So, where would you go to look for examples of like good artists in this genre? Besides just reading the comics themselves, do you do any like online research to find new artists?
Not as such. The big thing for me in college was when Humanoids Publishing started releasing a lot of new and re-released or republished European material in the States. And they used the normal traditional European size, oversized hardcovers, which on the one hand, they're absolutely gorgeous, but they're also like $20 for a 48-page book.
And that's back then.
That was in 2000. Yeah, I bought a number of those in college, and so then that was not very economical for them on the whole. Yeah. So they had some issues, and then they did a partial merger with DC, which put out some middling quality books, and now they're back to putting out new material. But then you also have Titan Publishing and their Static Press imprint releasing new European comics as well. Right. So I wouldn't really know where to look aside from some of the publishers if I wanted to find something, mainly because the only way you get the translated version is when it actually comes out.
Yeah.
So you can look at something and see that it looks really good, but without being able to read it and judge the quality, it's a little more difficult.
So there may be kind of a blessing and a curse aspect to these comics getting reprinted smaller, is that if they're reprinted smaller, we're losing quality, but we might get them cheaper and introduce more people to them.
Yeah, the Static Press version is a very good model, in my opinion, where they'll break a multi-volume thing into maybe 60 pages for $5 or $4, like the Atlas and Axis, which I made a video about, Atlas and Axis, and then the Alisic comic book. And both of those ones, Atlas and Axis is done by Pau, the Spanish artist, and it works out very well like Asterix, like a modern Asterix, with a sort of Viking set, but all the characters are animals. Mm-hmm. And it has a very clean, and it translates very well. And I've been following him on Patreon as well, where he's putting out additional stories, some of which are completely text-free. And so he doesn't have to worry about translation issues in that sense. But outside of things like that, you know, the stuff that's oncoming, it's hard to really know. But when you're talking about older material, there's a lot of stuff that's slowly being re-released, or Dark Horse every now and then has put out material like they did their manga. They did a Dylan Dog, Nathan Never, and some of the other Italian horror comics were collected. And then it's definitely a different sort of genre for those two.
And maybe the important thing to remember is, you know, when I think of, you know, Hergé and Tintin, I think of World War II era comics. But this is really a thriving and continually ongoing independent industry that's flourishing overseas. And a lot of these are creators that we can find online and, you know, appreciate, even if it's harder to find, you know, collected editions of their books. There's a lot of opportunities to find their work now.
Yeah, they're not necessarily all on Twitter from my attempts to dig people up that I see on some of the Titan books. But you can normally, if you know, once you know the name, you can go looking around for some of that. And that's the thing too. Herge covered about 60 years with the main volume of the stories, maybe closer to about 60, I guess, between the 20s and the late 70s. Or early 80s for Tintin and the Picaros.
Wow.
So yeah, you're really seeing the century pass by. Like what was really amazing was his forecast of the space race, for instance, where he has a nuclear powered moon rocket 10 years before anyone actually left the Earth, but taking, you know, some of the classic science fiction theories and scientific theories that were being discussed at the time, and he puts together a fairly, maybe not necessarily plausible, but certainly entertaining on the level of anything put out by Hollywood during that period.
I definitely got that vibe from The Shooting Star, where some of the science fiction aspects of it were, you know, I thought, well, that wouldn't happen in real life, but it kind of makes sense if you lived in his world to sort of project forward and say, well, what if a magnificent meteorite, you know, strikes Earth, and then he has like this then he adds some fanciful imagination to it, like maybe the element's properties would, you know, irradiate mushrooms or something, like he's combining thoughts about what could happen scientifically with imaginative stuff, where what would it be like? Well, it's kind of like how, you know, Stan Lee would say, well, what if a radioactive spider bit you and that gave you spider powers, right? He's combining the idea of radioactivity mutating people with the fanciful idea of getting a spider powered dude.
Well, he's definitely taking a more some of those stories are definitely take a more fanciful view of things, but at the same time, that's something like that's also in the fun vein of things like the Professor Quatermass films from the BBC at the same time, and that whole semi-serious science fiction, but with a real adventure streak that would be a lot harder to film too.
Yeah. So like manga and anime, that's obviously blown up in popularity. It's sort of become like, you know, every young adult's, you know, reading material at the library. Have you touched into that market much in your reading?
Not in reading as much. I've been a fan of anime off and on. When I was growing up, I saw bits and pieces, but then when the DVDs started coming out, that's when I started collecting as well. Some of them older, reaching back, and others more contemporary. So as far as manga, I have a few key titles. I collected most of the Trigun books when they were coming out in English initially. And then I have some of the Vampire Hunter D books. And I'm a big fan of Junji Ito. But other things, it's more of a depending on I have a lot of collections I'd like to check out,
Yeah.
more recent ones, but it's been a matter of priorities so far.
Okay.
And
Would you?
I don't because of the lack of color in from or also the different style of movement lines. It's doesn't work for me quite as well most of the time.
That's interesting. Okay, so maybe it'd be fair to say that you had a childhood connection with European comics, and you do connect with some Japanese artists, but they kind of have to speak to you as an adult. You don't necessarily have like that childhood nostalgia for any of them.
Yeah, I'm not looking for something like, especially something like One Piece that's like 300 volumes
Oh
long.
yeah.
I want a if it's going to be something like that, I want a solid story.
Well,
So the one,
well,
for instance, I'm really looking forward to is the Naoko Urasawa's Monster.
yeah.
I have the collected anime as an import from Australia, but it is I'm looking forward to just seeing that because that's probably the anime I've seen that most closely resembles Hergé's Tintin
Wow.
in terms of style and characterizations.
Okay, so you said earlier that sometimes the motion line doesn't work for you, and that's of interest to me because I think when I first was exposed to it, the I call it the rush of manga, really struck me. I think that the even in if you look at something like the Bat manga, where what is it, Juro? I forget the artist's name, but he adapted Silver Age Batman stories, and it's clear that he copied a lot, but then whenever an action scene would come along, he'd just like blow everything up, 180 degrees. He'd want, like all the actions to be bigger and to have, a million more motion lines and to like burst from the page. So
I think some cases it just makes it harder for me to focus on something, and partly that might also be because the lettering for the noises is never translated.
mm,
And so you always have these big not icons, big characters taking up space
yeah,
and it's just hard to figure out exactly what that noise is supposed to be even.
right.
And yeah, I mean, if there's motion line and no other background, it's just a different sort of thing than having context for the motion.
It's exciting, but like I think of Popeye, by Cigar, like everything was a really tiny drawing, but it still had a lot of energy because he'd work within that small context to show you Popeye's punch. So a manga Popeye with like the extra motion line, it wouldn't have that same warmth as kind of like the old Popeye drawings would. Would that be like a fair way of illustrating it?
Probably. I mean, it's just like I can get motion in something like Tintin just by putting a little curly cue by the wheel behind the Jeep
Yeah,
or some exhaust or some dust under the wheels. I mean, it depends on, I mean, granted, the most manga, it depends what kind of manga it is.
yeah.
Some manga, if it's, something like the Blame series where it's 95% background and then you have uh, key seconds or a couple key frames, then it works really well because in the part of the story. But I don't. It's just hard sometimes, especially if it's a smaller picture to follow things in a linear fashion.
Right. And of course, it's fair to note that, you'll get a lot of variety amongst manga artists, even if we can kind of say generally there seems to be this, trend that, Japanese artists, they favor a lot of motion lines. You'll find, as many varieties under the sun in Japan as anywhere else in the world.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's definitely certain things depending on the speed or the type of genre. Then you don't necessarily see that. I just haven't some of the ones I want to pick up of
Yeah.
different genres, other like more Junji Ito or uh, more Blame or Monster. I just haven't had the opportunity yet, time
Uh,
wise.
well, let me throw one out that I've been really digging. Are you familiar with Kyoko Hikawa's From Far Away?
You might have said that once, or you
Uh,
might have showed a clip of it, but made a video, but the name kind of rings a bell, but not the mangaka.
All right, it's probably from me mentioning it over and over again because I've just recently returned to it, and it just sort of struck me that you mentioned, like it sometimes stinks if you can't understand what the sound effects are. Like that came from a period where they were actually redrawing the sound effects in English. And I think since then the standards become they like to keep the sound effects Japanese, but they'll have a tiny little translation maybe like in the margins or something.
Okay.
It's been interesting how like many different ways they've tried to bring manga into the English market. Like first they flipped it around and then they preserved the original format, but they changed the sound effects, and now they want to preserve Japanese sound effects. Like I can tell, I'm sure there's a lot of healthy debate within the manga community about what's the best way to transliterate some of this stuff into English. But I do think you'd enjoy From Far Away. A, it's short, so it's not like 80 volumes. B, it's story driven, and C, it actually does make an effort to translate a lot of the Japanese concepts and sound effects into English.
I'll keep that in mind. If you send me a link later on, I can look it up or post one down below.
Will do. Except tragically, I can't stand how Google does comics. Like I can't even read the
No, just send it. Give me like an Amazon link or something.
Sure thing. Yeah. All right. So maybe back to Bande Dessinées. So you mentioned to me kind of like in private that you'd actually read a bunch of Hungarian comics. So what would be some like top recommends that you've read that you think that fans of Hergé or the general styles we've been talking about would enjoy?
Well, that might be a slight. It wasn't quite Hungarian. One I would recommend. There is a Yves Chaland, is another Belgian artist, and he worked for a few years. He died tragically young in the mid '80s, I believe. But he did a character called Eddie Lombard, and I was thinking about making a video of his books. There's 6 collected books put out by Humanoids in like 2-3 book collections, hardcover, the Chaland anthology. And it's the sort of thing, it's a lot like if Tintin was in the early 80s, but he was with a couple younger friends, kind of like, but older than Joe and Zet and Jocko from Hergé. But it's more of a contemporary real world France in the late 70s, early 80s. And they're dealing with like, a lost treasure under a castle again, or element, talking about crossing into actual Hungary. It was something. I was thinking about. It was the Hungarian uprising, but it's not the. It's something that was not in the 50s. It was not real world in that time frame. But yeah, there's some very interesting stories. They're not nearly to the level of Hergé, but they're still interesting for the time and place.
Yeah.
And the style, the character designs are very reminiscent of Hergé in terms of recognizable hairstyles and individuality in that sense. But they're more like, sorry.
I was going to say, how about the action itself? Like the depiction of action, does it have that sort of similar straight on, straightforward?
Yeah, it's more like you'll have someone drawing a pistol and then someone else doubling over. It's very or sneaking up on someone and trying to knock them out from behind. It's very matches that format very nicely, only it's very it's just interesting to see it in a early 80s format.
Someone has a comment here that might be of interest to you. Rick Deckard writes, check out Master Keaton, also by Urasawa. Some of the characterizations seem inspired by Tintin. Does that ring a bell?
Is that the detective show, or it's not the one? It's not related to the Case Closed, is it? There's a Keaton. I'm thinking Keaton's around, but
well, I'll ask Rick Deckard. So you want to know if Master Keaton's related to Case Closed, right?
Yeah, I might be just getting the names mixed up or some of the character designs.
Okay. I love Sherlock Holmes, so that was one of the ones I think I read before I even knew what manga was, because I just liked Sherlock Holmes style mysteries. So that touches a chord. You mentioned that anime. I wanted to ask you another one. Do you know Zatoichi at all?
Yes, but I'm familiar with the character, but I still have not watched any of the movies, to my great shame.
All right, I think it'd speak to you, mate. I watched him with my dad when I was a kid, before I was even watching anime regularly. And I think that samurai movies were kind of my gateway to anime, because the channels that would publish, like Japanese films, sometimes they'd advertise an anime, and I get really interested in that.
Kurosawa was definitely very, very influential on my movie viewing habits in college. Checking those out from the library before I had the money to buy them. But
I'd recommend Kurosawa to any
Yeah.
comic artist. I think he was a director ahead of his time, and pacing, the visuals. There's something. Sometimes you can't even describe what it is, but when someone has an utterly unique style, it's like it speaks to you, and you can just say the name, and you evoke the mental picture of what that is in your mind. And I think the comic artists, they strive to have that kind of uniqueness to their style, and film is a great place to look for inspiration for visual power.
Yeah, the now defunct channel, Every Frame a Painting, has an excellent video or two on Kurosawa and framing scenes in Seven Samurai. But yeah, the main thing with that is like Kurosawa was a real master when it came to film. But you're right, Zatoichi, and there's a few other characters, uh, is like a salaryman character and some other ones where they put out films once or twice a year over 20 years. And so they have this huge thing. And so some of the stories wind up being a little repetitive, but they also, they're ingrained in the consciousness, the popular consciousness there, the same way we had characters over the years, not just Marvel, but folks like the Lone Ranger or, with some ones they're like even Blondie. I think I haven't seen any of those movies, but they had a whole series of them back in the day, around the early 40s, which is kind of interesting too.
That's kind of an interesting thing to note, is sometimes whether a character becomes iconic or not is whether you tell a lot of stories with the character and they kind of are continually with a people for a chunk of time. Like James Bond has been that with
that's probably a better example. More contemporary.
But I can confirm that based on just my experience with Japanese film, is they would sometimes crank out 20 films in a series, all with the same actor, right? Like they wanted to make these movies as fast as they possibly could.
Yeah, it was never, after the studio system broke in the 40s. I don't think they really were able to bring back some of those things the way they did in the early period.
Yeah.
And like, I really love, you get the collected edition of Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd or some of those, but that's the short comedies are kind of a different category.
By the way, Rick Deckard confirmed that there's no relation between Master Keaton and Case Closed. So I guess that was just a coincidence.
Yeah, I'll just have to look that one up later then.
This might be a little too new, but I've seen like My Hero Academia is like the popular one, and it seems like there's just been a character introduced in the anime who I think has a distinct Tintin look. Like he has the simple eyes and he has the upswooped hair.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I just watched that last night, but it's whether they're going to make him like a Western character or something similar. The way he was talking made it sound kind of like he was an exchange student, kind of like that other girl. But I don't know if that's intentional or. But yeah, the look of the character is very striking, comparatively speaking.
Right. I've also heard some hearsay that was the artist paying homage to some of his like big brothers in the manga industry. So the meme I saw was that it's supposed to be One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach. So he's kind of like giving a pat on the back to some of the people who were like his big brothers as he was coming up in the manga industry. But I bet that I bet that there is a lot of creep in the manga industry where they're looking at work like Tintin, especially if you're conscious. I think anyone who thinks about making comics as like a discipline where they want to really think about the pace of storytelling, I bet you that Tintin has crept into that market.
I wouldn't be surprised. Those books were the first ones to really get translated and released worldwide. I've never laid eyes on a Japanese copy, so I'm not sure, how well it translated with the manga format, but I know they were released almost everywhere else.
Yeah. Oh, do you have something pop up back there?
No.
All right, that might have been me. All right. So let's see. We talked about Bande Dessinées. We've talked about some of your personal experience with it. Do you want to talk a little bit? I want to talk about your channel some more because I've really appreciated your channel. And like people used to say about my channel, you know, like they'd say I'm criminally undersubbed, and I take that as a compliment. And I hope you take it as a compliment. I think you're criminally undersubbed in that you're so thoughtful, you're so considerate in like putting out good content, unique content. And I think anyone involved, just not even involved with any particular hashtag, but anyone involved in comics discussion would really appreciate the work you're doing, because you're looking at work that no one else is looking at. And I appreciate someone who will actually introduce me into something new. So could you, so I've complimented you, but could you tell us a little bit about your taste in comics? Like what floats your boat?
Well, like I said before, it's just something that's different, and in some cases something that I can tell someone has really put a lot into it. So I talked about the Underburbs before. I talked about Crockett's Opie the Warhead, and I have some other solo publishers I want to make videos for soon. That's one of the things I'm behind on, since my production schedule and production format is not very professional at this point. But it's about, there's a lot of folks out there I know who are putting stuff out. Like I was, you know, it was great to see Rags take off.
Yeah.
But, you know, a lot of other folks I know put the work in over years. Like there's a video I need to make for one of my buddies who has a webcomic called Among the Chosen. And he's put over 20 years of work into it, and he has 800 plus pages online. But I don't know if it's ever going to get any real printing, but I need to put together a real promo video for him soon.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff out there, and you know, like the Underburbs, and you're like, this is really well written. This is, you know, he hits all ages, but he makes it funny. It's the kind of thing you want to see that you would take your kids to see in animated film or something like a Pixar type thing. You know, maybe there's little cultural references here and there that may not wind up being as timeless, but the amount of effort put in and the humor and the artistic style at the same time just works so well. And then on the other hand, Pistol Whip Press, I did that little video for Steel Verse for Scott Schmidt. And, you know, you don't see a comic about, you know, a Royal Canadian Mounted Police guy in the 1880s in Canada, in the Canadian wilderness. I mean, the fact that, you know, he has more issues he's trying to do, but just the concept alone, but then with solid artwork and solid realistic storytelling is just something I can appreciate.
Yeah. So what's spoken to me about your channel is you're obviously a deep appreciator of, you know, impactful storytelling in film and comics. Do you have any ambitions to like make comics yourself?
Yeah, I have a few stories I've been piddling around with for the last few years, and all the stuff that's been going on this last year or so has really lit the fire. And when I take some time off in this next month, hopefully, and away from the computer or away from the internet, I'm going to try and get some solid writing in on there. I have some real world building science fiction ideas, as well as something much closer to home in terms of the last 20 years of conflict that I hope that I do not believe has been addressed in any way, shape, or form from what I've seen in comics.
Interesting. All right. Now, is that drawing your own work of your profile?
I can't draw anything. I will be paying someone most likely. Okay. I have zero artistic talent.
Well, but is that drawing your work?
Oh, the drawing of my icon?
Yeah.
No. I said on my channel about, that's from Crockett, Zach Crockett.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I've worked with him before, and a number of other artists on other projects. I've commissioned stuff. I've commissioned art from like Nate Stockman before a few years ago, and that's why what's disappointing, I think, is, you know, seeing some of his work for Marvel. I think he's probably on either a schedule or a money crunch from them, because his work in his Image comics and his Dynamite comics was much more vibrant and much more professional, in my opinion. But There's a lot of other folks out there though who are developing, and
Yeah.
plenty of folks I'd love to pay if I had the money. If I won the lottery tomorrow, I'd have a blast with
Oh, definitely.
art.
Yeah, I get that feeling of just being blessed with too many good stories to be able to pick. So maybe like one reason I think it's especially important for people to check out your channel is I kind of see the value of critique is, at its worst, critique is just like, yelling about movies and not really offering anything constructive. But at its best, critique is both a thoughtful look at why storytelling is good, and it indicates to people what artists they should be looking at. So, kind of at their best, the critic cares about art and introduces people who are interested in art to new artists. And in the digital age, we're now blessed with opportunities for lots of people to talk about these kind of things. And I think you're the type of person who I would trust to give me a recommendation based on all the passion and all the reading you've done. And so I want to see that. I want to see your channel grow, and I want to see you like continuing to offer me like whole artists and comics for me to go check out. So keep at it, mate.
Yeah, I appreciate the support there. So I definitely will try and make an effort about getting new content out a little more frequently, even if it's not necessarily the movie reviews.
What I kind of experienced was, for a while I felt the pressure to like make daily content because all the YouTubers were saying make daily content, and for a while I was able to do it, like especially when I was spending too much on comic books. But then you burn out, and then life intervenes. So I definitely think for like the small time YouTuber, like not daily but regular is a good rule of thumb. So people, are hearing from you. They're hearing like about, what you're reading and what you're recommending, but you're not burning yourself out too much, in relation to the rest of your life.
Yeah, I managed to do a weekly movie review for a number of months last year, but that definitely did not work out indefinitely. So I will try and probably work on the movie reviews once every 2 or 3 weeks, and then try to get 1 or 2 comic videos a week going forward. But I'll see how that works out. It's going to flex a lot, but it's a better goal than trying to get yourself wedged into a certain commitment.
Right. I think that's a good rule of thumb for smaller YouTubers is you don't like worry about making a set amount of content so you go viral. You worry about making content you care about topics you care about. And if you have the it's sort of like a mix of fortune and diligence to go viral. You've got to keep making really good work, but there also have to be like some algorithm lightning has to strike, and you can't go into YouTube thinking I'm going to be PewDiePie and be a millionaire off of this. You got to go into YouTube passionate about the subject matter and about making content about things you care about.
Yeah, and generally it turns out there's not actually as many people passionate about something as you are. So that's lessons learned or life takeaways as well.
Yeah. Well, I'd appreciate any questions from the live chat at me. Oh, okay. John Dillard Gaming the System, an excellent artist. Oh, okay. So he's got a couple. So John says, tell him to give us a short story of what your comic project is about.
This is not going to be anytime soon. So conceptually, let's take actually no, sorry. I've talked to a couple people about it. I don't really want to get too far in the weeds yet, since I really just don't have anything on paper yet.
Okay. Well,
it's something that is near and dear to me in my work right now, and going back the last 18 years or so, it's just figuring out the best way to cover it professionally and appropriately. And it's not necessarily realistic in some senses, but it's just a different tone, I think, than what we see. I mean, it was interesting seeing Mark Millar and Garth Ennis and folks like that talking about certain things or asking questions on Twitter about certain specifics. And you're like, even these guys who are really good writers, and especially with the history stuff from World War II, that it's a different game different scenario in the 21st century, and no one has really been willing to tackle it for probably various reasons, some more obvious than others. But I think it's possible to also handle some of those topics appropriately and professionally without bringing the controversy to into play if you take your time and put it together properly in one piece.
So you can't tell us the story yet because you want to like get it committed.
I really want to put some effort into formulating it. Right now, I have a concept about it. Covers a deployment and then the home front and then another deployment with new characters showing up.
Okay.
But it's really just there's some superhero aspects of it. It's just figuring out the best way to. I'm trying to frame the story, and I like the concept I have, but it takes me too long to get from my brain to the paper, so gotcha. I need to put some effort into that.
Okay, well, you've got a open invitation to, break the internet when your story's like near or reaching like Indiegogo project. Welcome back on the show, and we'll let people know some more of the secrets, because I'm curious now. I'm dead curious.
Yep, that's one of them. The other one is a lot more complicated, so that'll probably take a lot longer.
Okay, so a couple concepts with like different vibes to them.
Yep.
John Dillard also asks, the best storytelling I ever saw was John Candy telling the story of the bald-headed killer bear of Clare County in the great outdoors. Does that ring a bell for you?
No, I don't think I ever watched that one. No, that was some of those films from that period were more or less visible depending on the time frame. Okay. I didn't have cable growing up.
And Eve La Renaissance, a regular here, she says, top 5 favorite movies.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Seven Samurai is definitely the top 5. Definitely Brazil by Terry Gilliam. Let's see. I always have trouble trying to count or trying to narrow them down.
I feel the pain.
Yeah, I haven't ranked anything in my head for a long time. One of my favorite movies will be reviewed next, hopefully this next week or so. So I'm not going to name it now.
Ooh.
It's a non-Western Western, though.
So that's a good reason for people to subscribe to your channel, is to see that one when it comes out.
Yeah, if they want to. Mind Game, the anime movie I reviewed last year, I think that's definitely in my top 10.
Okay.
But yeah, that is just an absolutely mind-blowing film. And also, in terms of anime, anything directed by anything directed by, I can't remember his name now. The guy who directed... He directed The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, Summer Wars.
And Wolf Children, right?
Yes, Wolf Children and something else. The Boy and the Beast. Susumu
Mamoru Hosoda?
Mamoru Hosoda. Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah. But yeah, anything he does is always good. But definitely top 5, though. Let's see, one more U.S. or British film.
I definitely think that like Miyazaki was the one that everyone in my college was really digging when I was in college, and I think that he's had the effect of like introducing artists like Mamoru Hosoda. Like there's this great talent pool in that country, and then once you find one person, you start looking for other people, and then you discover these people.
Definitely, and I think they're all influential, and you see a lot of the teams working together and building their own studio from scratch after they learn some of the basics as well.
I was stalling for time. Did you ever think of that last one?
No, it's I I don't even have my mental picture together for
That's all right. I might
movies
change
right
it
now.
on your mind. Well, you got four, so that's good. Oh, okay. By the way, have you seen the anime adaptation of The Seven Samurai?
I have it. Yeah, I just started rewatching it a couple weeks ago.
Okay, thoughts
Samurai
on that?
7.
Is it a bastardization of Kurosawa, or is it a decent homage?
It's interesting. Obviously, only a couple of the characters really seem to align very nicely, and the setting though is absolutely gorgeous,
Yeah,
and the technology is very well done. The scale, I love anything with a massive scale,
yeah.
so in that sense, it works very nicely. But it's also a little unrealistic in terms of the odds, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe they were kind of like mixing and matching their genres. Like Kurosawa seems pretty grounded. Like he doesn't have too many like spectacular, like upside down, backwards, blindfolded, cut the candle in half 100 times, kind of kinds of things. And
Yeah, it's not quite Zatoichi style filmmaking.
John Dillard says, "Just say Mean Girls." We all know it's Mean Girls.
No, maybe Kamikaze Girls.
I don't know that one. Is it interesting?
It's extremely entertaining, and it's that's another interesting director as well.
Any other like topics you'd like to touch on while we're together for interesting films, interesting comics, or things about your channel that'd be worth talking about?
As far as comics, just a couple of the recommendations. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Jodorowsky's comics. I haven't really watched any of his movies still, but Alejandro Jodorowsky was the creator of the Inkle with Mobius, and then later on the Meta Barons, and he's done a bunch of other one-off stories or sagas, spin-offs, all set in the same universe as the Inkle and the Meta Barons, including Megalex and the Techno Priests. And all of those, they're kind of a mishmash of ultra violence, kind of like Judge Dredd, but extremely graphic detail and but it's also a epic space opera. Although the quality does vary from book to book in some cases. Meta Barons is, I think, my favorite overall in terms of design. But then there's also Enki Bilal, who was a Yugoslavian immigrant who went to France and started writing books. And so he's famous especially for the Nikopol trilogy, which was adapted in part as Immortal in a film, in a CGI film. He actually directed it back in 2001 or 2002. And the problem with that is that it came out right after the Final Fantasy movie. And so he actually does it with like 3 or 4 live action characters and everyone else is CGI.
Wow.
But the quality and the budget just isn't there to do that sort of project. And it compares very unfavorably to the Final Fantasy movie graphically. But in terms of big thinking and big ideas, it's definitely in a league of its own, much like his comics.
So sometimes an artist might be a little too ahead of themselves on anticipating the future of cinema.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it has a bunch of several big name European actors and actresses like Charlotte Rampling and I blanking on other names right now, but it was just a very unique sort of project. And it's one of those ones that was fairly popular in Japan artistically, but not as much in other markets.
What's interesting about this is, you just like name dropped 2 directors I've never heard of. And as soon as I Google them, I'm interested. And something I've been an advocate for on this channel is having a variety of media for what you consume. So like I say to like manga nerds, don't just read manga, read all kinds of comics. I say to people who are kind of purists about, just superhero comics, don't just read superhero comics, read all kinds of stuff, because the more variety you have to what you read, it's like the more types of stories and types of characters you can draw from for your own imagination. I think that a lot of creative storytelling comes from reading and facilitating this stuff. I call it like packing it into your imagination, and then you work based on what you've crammed into your head. So the more variety you have that you consume, the more you have to draw on when you go to the drawing board.
I think in some cases, and this may be from, in my experience, unique. I may be unique in this, but there's a fear that sometimes that you're going to put something out that someone else has already done.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you do continue to read or continue to do it. But as they've said, there's what, 3 stories in the world, and everyone, you know, obviously they've all been told already. So it's not necessarily if it's holding someone back as far as their creative inclinations. There's always your own spin you can put on it. I mean, obviously we don't always see that with the stuff that's actually getting published these days, but if you give it a little bit of thought, it's not impossible. It's definitely very bring your own nature to bear. Like one of the most unique projects I've seen is the Gankutsuo anime series, which is a retelling of the Count of Monte Cristo in anime form. And obviously the graphical style is absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And it is so surreal and psychedelic, but it is a very ambitious but very successful, in my opinion, portrayal. Obviously, you know, there's more to be said than just adapting a classic, but that concept is, you know, there's always something new you can do with a established story.
Right. I call it creative reinterpretation. Like Gankutsuo, it has a giant robot battle in it, but I take it completely seriously as an adaptation of the Count of Monte Cristo. Sometimes I think because in these longer format stories, they have a little bit more opportunity to touch on some of the themes in the original. Like you can't capture an 800-page book in a 30-minute, you know, little cartoon. It takes a little bit of time in that universe to have some of these ideas come out.
Definitely, you need to allow something the room to breathe. Yeah. And so you don't want to make it over long, but you don't, and overstay its welcome, but you also don't want to try and cram too much in, which is, you don't want to have 16 different subplots if one subplot is all you need.
Right.
And that is what Red Letter Media was talking about with their Predator review this week. And you're just like, you know, the original Predator was groundbreaking just because it took such a simple concept and let it work. All you have is a bunch of men being hunted by a monster, and that works for a feature-length film. It wasn't an hour-long TV episode or anything else. You don't have to make everything 7 seasons long of 20 episodes a season just to tell your story, or maybe you do, but you have to make sure you got a reason for it.
And the quote I've always resonated with, I think, is Ray Bradbury. You know, he'll talk about, you know, write 100 stories, and your first story will suck, your first 10 stories will suck, but by the time you've written 100 stories, one of them will resonate. And I think there's truth to that, because you're going to write some derivative stories, you're going to write some really unique stories with maybe an interesting concept, but no idea what to. That's been sort of part of my problem as a writer. Sometimes I'll have like a really, oh, this would be an interesting concept for a sci-fi story, but I've got no character to go with it. Or I might have characters who exist in my head and I can, you know, understand the depths of their personality, but I'm not sure like what to do in the plot with them, right? So it's really the practice of continually being in the good habit of reading and writing and drawing that helps you develop the habits you need to start producing masterpieces. You're not going to be able to produce it on purpose. You're going to produce it as you're just sort of naturally creating.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. My problem right now is I can put out reams of dialogue in my head, but when I sit down to actually type it, it suddenly becomes much slower and much more painful. And it's one of those things where I look at the way someone else writes, and so I think I can do it as a comic because I'm not trying to think of all this extra filler text. Yeah. I'm just telling the artist, this is roughly what I want to portray, and this is what I plan for the characters to say. But I don't have to. I can build some of the internal monologue, but it's not like I don't have to come up with 3 pages describing what the room looks like or something dumb like that.
You remind me of maybe the most important thing I learned from one of my teachers, and this is codename the badass. If you guys have heard me talk about my art teachers before, but she told me try not to use your imagination unless you have paper in front of you, because
that's a good idea.
Yeah. And so what I ended up doing is I have these little, chicken scratch scrawls and really loose, like 1-second doodles, but it's all I need to remind me of the initial prompt. And sometimes getting into that creative space is the hardest thing. That's why you stare at a blank piece of paper and you don't know what to draw or what to write, is you don't know how to get into that space. But if you can record what you create while you're in that imaginative space, then the little drawing or the little note on the napkin, that becomes your jarring point to take you back into that world and into that situation. Sometimes it's maybe just like a little scene or dialogue that you don't use, but maybe it's the power of the moment that's more important than that.
I have a little audio recorder I take with me in the car sometimes, but most of the time I just forget to use that. I think I have bits and pieces scrawled on it, and I have files that are slowly building on my computer, but it's a complicated process of figuring out the right time frame.
Do you read Mark Twain at all?
Not for a long time. It's there's some books I'm planning on ordering again, but I haven't read anything through for quite a few years.
Okay, he had you might have to find an edition that has his preface to it, but his preface to Pudd'nhead Wilson, I'm going to dig that out myself and talk about it, because Mark Twain's preface to Pudd'nhead Wilson is one of the most interesting things I've ever seen a writer say about the craft of writing, because he tried to write a farce that was just going to be like this ridiculous thing about this carnival versus full of circus freaks, and then he started like killing off his characters one at a time and introducing a whole new cast of characters. By the time he killed off all his old characters, he figured, I'm kind of interested in telling a different story, so he rewrote it as Pudd'nhead Wilson after his first story failed. All right, are you still there, mate?
Yep.
All right. Well, I know that you've got work tomorrow, so I'd like to give you a chance to touch on anything you'd really like to touch on about your channel or about interesting work, and then I want you to get some sleep and get to work.
Well, I appreciate the support, and I think you've already done a lot of promotion for the channel. So, like I said, I need to keep a semi-regular schedule, but I may be looking at taking requests or things down the road. The first one I had from someone didn't turn out quite so well. From someone at Glibertarians.com. Their title suggestion was a bit of a dud, but the actual Yugoslavian film that I reviewed, the Marathon Family, was a recommendation from someone else there. So
nice.
That, of course, that review is blocked worldwide for copyright reasons.
Oh,
so
wow.
I will get a BitChute account set up very soon, hopefully.
Oh, good for you. I think that's a really good format, and I'm surprised by how many people I get on BitChute, even though it's a not YouTube. I think it's a YouTube alternative where there's actually some passionate people who are interested in using BitChute. So it is a good option, I think, for YouTube.
I got a lot of European viewers when I was uploading VidMe, because I would be uploading and then the Germans would come along and watch it right as it was, because it would post your video in order of upload, and so it would always show up in that. You'd have a bunch of people just checking it out as it came up. But yeah, Europeans, I think, with all the issues, I don't know if that's going to be an access issue for folks in the future, but I need to start uploading my content there as well, as to make up for the YouTube issues.
Right, especially if you start doing live streams at all with people. Like I always download my live streams, because I always wonder, I'm always, maybe I got a tinfoil hat, but I'm always waiting for the Google overlords to come in and shut me down.
Maybe not necessarily, but as a matter of principle, it's always good to have the backup material, and then you can clear out some of that dead space as well.
Better safe than sorry. Yeah. All right. Well, I've really appreciated having you on. I've enjoyed your feedback. I've enjoyed your channel, and you are a thoughtful person about storytelling, and that's the wonderful thing about the internet, is getting to meet people who talk about and think about similar things you're interested in. Oh, okay, John Dillard, this is an important question. Adam Marmaduke, what is the channel called? It is called LT Fish, right?
I think the channel on YouTube is still Fish Likes Flicks.
Fish Likes Flicks, and I have linked it in the description below. So even though I misremembered the actual name of the channel, you can link to it right down below in the description. And your Fish Like Flicks on Twitter too, right?
Yeah, at Fish Likes Flicks.
At Fish Likes Flicks. Alrighty. Well, I want to thank the chat. We got some like interesting recommendations. This is exactly what I wanted. I knew we'd get like a lot of interesting recommendations of things I'd never heard before, and we got exactly that. So I want to thank the lovely chat. I want to thank you, Lieutenant Fish, and I'll give you a chance to say goodbye to everyone.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It was a pleasure chatting with you. And next time I will try and collect a few more useful lists and references
Sure.
For future discussion. But now that I have an idea what kind of questions may be asked of me.
Oh, and
congratulations again.
You don't need to commit to this now, but I want to float it by you. Since we're both interested in Tintin, you know, and that was particularly like my introduction to this genre of comics. It might be fun for us to look at maybe like a particular Tintin story, and I could even like share it on the screen, and we could wax about Hergé's line or the storytelling page or something to that effect. Would that be just a idea that would be of interest to you at least?
I think that would be very interesting to go through at some point in the future.
Fantastic. So we'll keep that in mind for future. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone again, and I will wish you good night.
Thank you very much.